Hi, everybody. My name is Kristen McLean. I work for the NPD Group, and I'm pleased to be here today to give you a look at U.S. book industry trends and insights for the SEPA 2021 Summit. I'm the Executive Director and the Primary Industry Analyst for the NPD Books Group. We are the organization in the U.S. that runs BookScan. So we study the point of sale book market here in the US. And in case you don't know who we are, NPD is a global research company. We are running services in 19 countries that include the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. The data that we track for the book market is just for the US, but we do have a broader business around the world. We work with about 2,000 different companies and brands as clients. And we bring in point of sale data from about 600,000 retail locations around the world. So we're pretty robust, and the books group sits within a larger entertainment practice that includes toys for the global market, media entertainment, video games, and juvenile products. But we track a lot more than that. These are the more than 20 industries that we track here at NPD. So one of the things that's really great about working for NPD as an analyst is that I am able to put book data in the middle of a much larger context and really look at how consumers are interacting with all different kinds of products in the US and globally. So it's a pretty cool job that I have. For those of you guys who are not familiar, this is a look at who's contributing to the data that we're going to mostly be looking at today. This is BookScan's Retail US panel. And you can see that pretty much everybody that you would expect to be in it for the US market is here. So our data includes print book sales from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the independent bookstores, Target, Walmart, their .com businesses, as well as a really wide range of other specialty retailers, including other bookstore chains, supermarkets, airport stores, and various specialty shops. So it's a pretty robust panel of data that comes into us. And we benchmark it at about 85% of the US trade market. So, but to be clear, what is not in here, this doesn't include sales to schools and libraries. It doesn't include sales to distributors, those who distribute books in the US market. And it doesn't include direct market sales to organizations like corporations or direct from publisher websites. So when we get to the point where we're talking about the Christian data, there are some things that are missing because of that, right? So we are not tracking all church sales, although we do have a bunch of churches in our church bookstores in our data. And we are not tracking some types of author events. So sometimes in the Christian market, you'll have a big revival event or an author tour where the data is not sold through BookScan reporting retailers. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it is the best view that we have for print data for the US. For today's presentation, I'm going to be pulling on 3 different data sets. So the first is BookScan, which we just discussed. That really is our gold standard point of sale tracking data from the US. It's taking in reporting from 16,000 retail locations, about 13 to 15 million units weekly. We're running about 15 million units right now. And as I said, it's about 85% of the US trade market. I'm also going to show a little bit of data from our PubTrack digital product. That's our ebook tracking service. And unlike BookScan, PubTrack digital comes to us from direct publisher reporting. So for the publishers who participate, and there are about 450 of those, we get all of their ebook sales through all channels. But because it is reported from publishers, there is an 8-week delay on the data, and it comes monthly, not weekly. So we're going to be looking at ebook data through the midpoint of 2020 today. And then we also this year launched a new product called PubTrack Digital Audio. This is a digital tracking service for digital audiobooks. It's a smaller group of publishers. It's a new product, so we're still building out the panel, but we will be able to look at some really great data for the Christian audio market in particular. So we'll take a look at that today. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to put a little caveat out there. because although our data is very good and very comprehensive, when it comes to talking about Spanish language sales and Christian market sales, those are very special parts of the market. And there are some books moving around that we don't see in our data. So for instance, when we talk about the Christian market, there are two major retailers that are not reporting to our data right now in the US. One is christianbooks.com, which is the second largest online retailer of Christian books. And the other is Hobby Lobby, which is a craft and hobby shop, but it does a very strong business in Christian books also. So it's not that we don't want these retailers to report, we do, but for their own reasons right now, they're not reporting. So just keep in mind that we have a little bit more of a gap when it comes to the Christian data than what we do see in the overall trade market. And then Spanish language, there is a certain amount of Spanish language sales that are happening also outside of our view that are mostly direct market, and also we don't see library circulation. There's quite a bit of Spanish language books that are circulating through the library system. So just keep that in mind. Okay, today, so we're going to start with a look at the overall US book market at the top line, just to show you what's been going on. And then we're going to take a look at the Spanish language book trends. We're going to talk about the Christian book market performance for adult and for children's Christian books. And then I'll finish with a few key takeaways. So I like to start with a metaphor always when I do these presentations, because it's been a pretty dynamic couple of years for the US book market. And, you know, especially during the pandemic here in the US last year in 2020, we saw really an unprecedented kind of up and down pattern for the US book market, which is usually very, very steady. The US book market is very large, it's very mature. And so we tend to have 1 or 2 point differences, not 25-point differences like other areas of consumer goods in the US. So last year and this year have been very dynamic for the book market. As you'll see from the data that I'm about to show you, things have settled down here in the US, but there are a lot of things going on underneath the surface that I think are going to continue to impact the book market. So although the book market itself is very steady, underneath it, we have things like supply chain disruption, which everyone is really talking about right now, which is making it very difficult for publishers and authors. We have changes in retail generally in the US, with a lot more people shopping online than were shopping online before the pandemic. So that's changing some things. We are seeing traditional retailers in the US make adjustments. We have publishers in the US that are consolidating. So we've seen 2 of our major publishers buy other publishers this year. And we've seen our largest publisher, Penguin Random House, try to buy the 3rd largest publisher, Simon & Schuster. And we just heard that merger, that the government is going to sue over that merger. So there's just a lot going on, which is really affecting individual publishers, individual authors, and some distributors. But consumers in the US are doing fine. We're having one of our best years ever. And these disruptions right now aren't really impacting consumers' desire or buying behavior. So this is a 16-year look at the US book market from 2004 to 2020, with print books in the bottom on the dark blue and our ebook data on the top in green. And you can see that when you combine the print and the ebook data, 2020 was a record year for us in the book market. So for print anyway, but also for e together, it was a really good year. And one of the things that the pandemic taught us is that when things get tough, the book market does better. And this was true in the United States also during the 2008 financial crisis. So for informational, for educational, and for entertainment reasons, books tend to overperform when things get tough. And 2020 was really a very strong demonstration of that. And this year, you can see on the right, this is the year-to-date view. This is through through Q3, so through the beginning of October, that we're actually up 11% over 2020. So we are set to have another historic year here in the US book market. And it's been driven by a lot of different things. Some of it is certainly the pandemic and the fact that people had more time at home to read. So adult fiction has been very strong in the US. But there are other things there too. So people are buying a lot of children's books because they want to offset some of the difficulty for children. Some of the social movements in the US, like Black Lives Matter, have driven a lot of interest in adult books about discrimination and civil rights, as well as children's books about diversity and belonging. The fact that people had to school their children from home last year, we sold a lot of educational books in 2020 and into 2021 for kids. So there's just a lot going on in there, but it's been a very good year. Now, we know that actually people are reading more in the United States. It's not just that they're buying more, because we run consumer research every summer where we measure a bunch of different entertainment behaviors. And this past summer we ran, it's called the Evolution of Entertainment Study. And we measure books along with things like watching streaming video, or going to the movies, or going out to restaurants, or spending time online. And what we heard is that in the previous 6 months to this study, which was in August, 71% of the people who we surveyed said that they were engaged with books, and that the time that they were spending with books was up 10% over the previous year, and the dollars that they were spending were up 16%. So people are reading more and buying more books during the pandemic because they have a lot of time on their hands, and that reinforces what we were seeing in the sales data. This is a week over week view of the sales trend in the United States in units. So the green is 2021, the blue is 2020, and the gray line, the dotted line, is 2019 for reference. So you can see that we had a very strong start to the year here. We were up 29% at one point early in the year. That's sort of slowly come down. And you can see that the sales for 2021 in green have started to closely mirror 2020, but they're well above 2019. We're running about 102 million units ahead of 2019 right now in the US market. So the bump that we got from the pandemic has definitely continued, right? We are very, very close to 2020 numbers. So in my opinion, part of what's happening here is that that people had a lot of time on their hands to rediscover their love of reading. And also, once we got through last year's political cycle, which was very hard to look away from here in the US, people engaged in a lot more reading for pleasure and decompressing. So it's just been, there are just lots of factors, but it's been a really good year for us. We're going to have a historic year this year in the US book market. In terms of what's been driving this year versus last year, so this year the story really was about adult fiction. About 45% of what has been growing this year in terms of unit numbers has been driven by adult fiction. So, and adult fiction for me is a really important way of judging whether or not people are buying books for information or for pleasure. And this year, clearly people have been reading for pleasure. We also have seen growth in all of the other major subcategories in the US, except for juvenile nonfiction, which, as I said last year, we sold so many kids' education books that this year we're just comping against just an unprecedented year last year. So we still actually have an elevated level of juvenile nonfiction selling above 2019, but we're under 2020 just because there's no way we could keep up with what happened last year. One of the things that we watch very closely, and it's a long range trend, but it's really important, is how much of the share of what's selling out the door is backlist books versus frontlist books. And if I went back again to 2004 and showed you the frontlist backlist share, it would be about 50-50 frontlist to backlist at the top line of the market. Fast forward to 2020, And we were at 67% backlist, 33% frontlist, which is kind of where we're holding more or less. So we've lost about 17 or 18 points of share from frontlist to backlist in the US. And we track this because it's, it has implications for the US publishing market, because a lot of what happens, especially in the larger publishers, is geared towards frontlist, right? We pay enormous advances to authors. We spend a lot of money to market books. And what we're seeing is that we're actually going towards a more backlist driven model, which is being driven by more online buying, because online buying favors backlist. It's also being driven by the fact that we have fewer bookstores than we did in 2004. And also there's just a lot competing for attention. So backlist books really do better in an environment where a familiar book, particularly in the children's space, will trigger a purchase because people are looking for some kind of validation when there's just a lot going on. So we talk a lot about this with publishers. And in the Christian market too, backlist has historically been a higher factor, just because of adoption of familiar books and of Christian reading materials. It tends to favor backlist. So anyway, but just so you know, it's really important, and it's something that we talk to publishers about all the time. And for us, a backlist book is a book that was published more than 12 months ago on a rolling basis. So a book today that published 12 months ago today would drop into a backlist sales bucket tomorrow, right? So it's a rolling figure. Okay, as I said, we started tracking digital audio. So we now have the ability to line up print data with ebook data and audio data. When we build these views now, we only look at the publishers that are in our audio reporting group. So this is a smaller group of publishers, but it does include HarperCollins and HarperCollins Christian. So this is a pretty accurate view of the Christian side of the market. Right now, we're at 65% print, 22% ebook, and 13% audio in that publishing group. And you can see the trend on those for the first half of the year in terms of sales. So print is up 25% among this publisher group. Ebooks are down 10% after having a very strong year last year during the pandemic. Digital audio is flat, but overall digital audio has picked up a point in share this year because ebooks have dropped. So it's pretty interesting. The one thing I will say about audio is that you can't really tell a lot about an individual title's performance by looking at this top line number. Because one of the things we've discovered is that depending on the category of the book, or in particular, the author and the narrator. So if it's a very famous author who is reading their own book, like sometimes those sales can exceed 70 or 80% of share. So just keep that in mind. Like we're starting to really look at the audio market has very different mechanics, and you can't really extrapolate or make P&Ls for expected audio sales off a top line number. You really have to dig into the data and look at comparable titles in order to understand what might be happening. In terms of the children's market, just want to point out, these are the top subjects in the overall children's market in 2021 this year. And I think the real story here is comics and graphic novels. So this is units, like the largest categories ranked by units on the left and by their absolute growth this year on the right. And comics and graphic novels is a much larger story. I'm not going to cover it very much today, but just know that on the children's side, comics and graphic novels have been growing pretty strongly for the last 7 or 8 years. And they were flat during the pandemic, but they're taking off again this year. Mostly driven by Dave Pilkey's Dogman series. Dave Pilkey is the author of Captain Underpants. And he and his publisher Scholastic have created a very strong market for middle grade comics and graphic novels. So there's a lot going on there. And on the adult side, comics and graphic novels, adult fiction category is also a very high growth category, mostly driven by Japanese manga, which is the Japanese comic book companion to Japanese animation. So that's being driven by streaming video here in the US. So people are discovering anime, which is there's a lot of it streaming right now, and then they're buying the manga that goes with that. And that's driving 75% of the growth in the adult comic and graphic novel market. So that's a very rich area of inquiry. And if you're interested in learning more about that, feel free to reach out after this presentation. The last thing I want to show you in the general market view here is just how strong kids series are in the US. So kids series are about almost 70% of sales for kids books fall in series right now. And that has, that's pretty stable over the last few years, but you can see how it's grown over time. So series is very helpful in the US retail market, partly because it works really well at mass market retail. So series in places like Target and Walmart are really easy to stock for those retailers. And then they work great in book fairs, and they're really helpful for parents. Like once a kid gets hooked on a series, it's really easy for them to just then follow on the series. So it's a pretty successful strategy that we see growing here in the US. Okay, Spanish language books. So Spanish language books make up about 1% of the total book sales in the US, but they are growing. You can see the year-to-date figures there through 23rd of October on the left. So we've gone from 3.1 million units in 2017 to 4.6 million units in 2021 in our print data. So keep in mind, there are some sales happening outside of what we can see. So this really represents the traditional part of the US trade market. And on the right, you can see the share of the different super categories within that. So the largest group of that is adult nonfiction, and quite a bit of that is happening in the religion category. And then the next section is juvenile fiction, adult fiction, juvenile nonfiction. And here's what those unit trends look like over time. So 2013 was a really a point where we really started to see things, I think, take off. And the sales trend over time is that adult books in Spanish language are up 39% since 2011, and kids books are up almost 100% since 2011. And here is what's what is making up that that Spanish language block here in the US. So as I said, the #1 category is religion in the adult nonfiction. And not only is it the #1 category by volume, it's also the #1 growth category for us right now. And then you can see the smaller categories underneath there, including social situations, juvenile fiction. That's a lot of books having to do with diversity and inclusion and social development for kids. These are the top 5 growth titles under that Spanish language religion category. And you can see that the Reina Valeria is really driving quite a bit of this. And it's interesting to me, the 4th highest growth title here, El Aviso, is a brand new title to the US market from Christine Watkins. Here are the top bestsellers overall in 2021. So those were the top 5 religion titles. These are the overall bestsellers. And when you pull back and look at the overall bestsellers for Spanish language, you can see that quite a few of these titles are children's titles. Sorry, I thought I had an animation on that. Anyway, about half of them are children's titles. So children's titles, particularly in concepts and early childhood, you see a lot of bilingual editions or straightforward Spanish editions. And these are very popular in the mass market retailers here in the US. So board book editions and Spanish language editions. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears to look at the Christian book market, specifically in the US, not just Spanish language. So the Christian market was one of the most hard-hit parts of the US market during the pandemic. It really went down very low in our data. Again, keeping in mind that one of our largest retailers, christianbook.com, is not reflected here. But it was very, very challenged when the pandemic hit and churches could no longer meet in person. Many church bookstores closed. And frankly, in those first few weeks of the pandemic, people were thinking about other things besides connecting with their faith. So there was a lot of pandemic purchasing and lockdowns going on, and families having to figure out how to educate their kids. So a lot of adult nonfiction categories, including religion categories, went down, and kids nonfiction categories went up. And the Christian market had a very hard time in 2020 recovering from that. It ended the year at -9% in our data. So the great story about 2021 is that the Christian market has recovered to 2019 levels. It's only about 200,000 units off its 2019 number right now, and it's up 10% over 2020. So it hasn't achieved that high growth above 2019 that the overall trade market has achieved, but the fact that it has recovered to 2019, especially since 2019 was a very big year for Christian books because Rachel Hollis's books were publishing then, which was a big seller. Girl, wash your face. Girl, don't apologize. Stop apologizing. So I think it's great that the market is back. It's a real success story. So one of the things that really hurt Christian during the pandemic is its dependence on the adult nonfiction category. So this is actually a snapshot of the US market in 2021 through August. But what you can really see here is that dark blue bar, which is the adult nonfiction category, how dependent, pushing Bibles aside, how dependent the non-Bible Christian market is on adult nonfiction. And as I said, adult nonfiction disappeared during the first 8 weeks of the pandemic in the US. So that really hit the Christian market hard. You can also see that juvenile fiction is much stronger in the total market than in the Christian market, and juvenile fiction and juvenile nonfiction were the majority of what we sold through the first half of the year after the pandemic hit. So that's kind of where we are. And I think there's some opportunities in there, though, for Christian publishers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, especially around children's. Here is the total market view in terms of the publisher market share in the US Christian market, with Harper Christian being the largest Christian publisher, holding about 25% of the MSRP value. So here we're looking at dollars, not units. Followed by a really diverse range of publishers underneath that. So Harper Christian really dominates at the top, but then we have a lot of other publishers making up that religious space here. The highest growth imprints at the moment are listed on the right. And the reason that we wanted to show this is that there are some imprints in here like Salem Books from Regnery, which are high growth publishers in a very established Christian market. And so this is something we're seeing through all of the US publishing market. There are these small, really nimble, high growth publishers like Regnery. There's another one called Rockridge Press, which is coming out of Callisto Media, which is a new publisher. These guys are looking for strategic opportunities, and they're putting really strategic titles into the market that sell very high quantities. In some cases, they're printing in the US, print on demand with a publisher like Ingram, in order to be able to really put a book into the market very quickly. And in a year with supply chain disruption, this has been particularly effective. So we are letting our larger publishers know to really watch for these strategic publishers, because we're seeing them take market share all over the US market, not just in Christian. Here are the top growing BISACs, excluding Bibles for this year. So Christian Life is the top growth category, which is great. I think this is really about people reconnecting with their faith and reconnecting with Christian values after a pretty rocky year last year at the pandemic. I think people in the US, between the pandemic and also the very polarized political situation here, there are a lot of people who are trying to figure out how to improve their outlook and feel better. And I think those who are Christian are re-engaging with their faith at a very high level right now. These are the top 8 titles in the US through the beginning of September. And what I think is really interesting about this is that the top titles that are non-biblical, or non-Bible rather, a lot of them are crossover titles that are selling actually really well in all different kinds of retailers in the US, not just Christian retailers. So we see a couple books by Lisa Turkhurst here. We see Patricia Schreier's Elijah, which is one of the more Christian books on this top list. The World Needs Who You Were Made to Be by Joanna Gaines, who's really one of the leading authors in the US right now between her Magnolia cookbooks and this book. And then also Sarah Jakes Roberts' book, Women Evolve, is part of a larger movement towards female empowerment. So here we're seeing an intersection of women's issues and Christianity. And we're seeing this intersection of women's issues happen in lots of places in the US market. So we're seeing women's issues and money management. We're seeing women's contemporary fiction doing really well. We're seeing a lot of self-help and personal growth titles that are aimed at women. So women's empowerment is definitely an overarching thread that we're seeing in the US market this year. Here is a look at the Christian audio categories. So this is getting at the point that I was making earlier about the fact that if you are publishing an audio, you have to really dig into the data a little bit to understand the fact that different categories have very different compositions when it comes to share. So on the left, you can see in the purple, that's all Christian. Looking at the print on the bottom, ebooks, and then audio at the top in green. So here you can see that that there's a pretty wide range. Christian life and Christian life women's issues are the 2 highest print categories. But in terms of where the most audio is, look at Christian life and family all the way in the right. There we're seeing 35% share in audio. And Christian romance, not really a surprise, but ebooks there, 42% of share. So there's a lot going on, and we have this data. If you are a subscriber to any of our audio data through the publishers, let us know if you want to talk more about this. Outside of that, just get in touch with me afterwards. Okay, the kids Christian market. So kids are really under-indexing in the Christian market in the US at a time when people are investing a lot in children's books. So we're talking a lot about this as an opportunity for Christian publishers. We have been for the last couple of years, but I think right now we're having another real strong moment. So again, this is the flip view, but just to remind you like what Christian looks like versus the total market, and really look at that green box, that's juvenile fiction, right? So 1 out of every 4 books in the total market is going out is a juvenile fiction book, but only 1 out of every 10 in the Christian market. And juvenile nonfiction is at parity between the 2 markets. So the real opportunity here is in juvenile fiction. And in my opinion, there are storytelling opportunities that have to do with values-driven stories. So it doesn't necessarily have to be overtly Christian, although I think there's a market for that. We see a lot of Bible stories, for instance, going out, which would be in the nonfiction category. But anyway, but things like stories about friendship, stories about being teaching morals and values, stories about inclusion, stories about the environment, all of that stuff, I think there is a real need for it right now. And in the US, Christian schools are actually in a growth period right now, particularly coming out of the pandemic. Part of that is the political polarization. Part of that, I think, is the moment that people are feeling that they want their kids in a more faith-based educational system. So that is also an opportunity for the Christian market. And of course, there are plenty of bilingual parochial schools in the US, also particularly major markets like California and Miami. Here's the 5-year trends for the overall Christian market, just so that I can show you what the kids market looks like in comparison. So you can see that growth of units year to date through October 23rd. You can see the change over the prior year. And then now just look at this bar chart on the left when I switch over to the children's view. So you can see that the trend line is steeper. We've had it's been pretty continuous from 2019. We're sort of back to those levels, but overall the growth in children's books since 2017 has been really strong. And but it's underperforming right now compared to the overall Christian market because of the bounce back in adult nonfiction, and definitely underperforming what's going on in the children's market in the top line. So we again think there's an opportunity here. Kids nonfiction in Christian space grew 1.5 times faster than fiction year to date right now. So a lot of that is Bible stories, but we do think again that given the strength of the overall fiction market for kids books, that there is an opportunity for more focused fiction publishing for kids. Here are the top growing and declining categories. So you can see Christian family, Mother's Day, Easter, and Bible stories are the top growth categories right now. The declining categories, holidays, social issues, learning, and action and adventure. The learning concepts, this is a drop off from last year a little bit, but these other categories, I think it's really a matter of the retail environment, particularly the holiday books. We've been selling a lot of holiday books through mass market in the US, and a lot of Christian bookstores and church bookstores are still not operating 100%. So I think it's a matter of discovery and shift in the buying channels that are driving some of these losses. In terms of the age breaks for Christian children's books, you can see that that the young reader, the 4 to 8 category, has the highest absolute gains this year. Middle reader is pretty flat, and infants up a little bit. Here are the bestsellers for the year to date through October 23rd. And the thing that becomes really clear when you look at this is that holidays and celebrations as a category falls under religion as a grouping, but many of the holiday books that kind of get grouped in here are secular. So Pete the Cat Easter book, for instance, How to Catch the Easter Bunny, Llama Llama Easter Egg. So we always see that when we look at kids books in the Christian space, there's always a lot of holiday books from secular publishers. There are some Bible stories on here though. And I think the fact that the Beginner's Bible is in the #1 spot also is speaking to that growth that we're seeing in re-engagement in faith in 2021 as people recover from the pandemic and make some decisions about how they want to educate their kids moving forward. So I'm sure everyone here is aware of what happened with Black Lives Matter in the United States in the summer of 2020, and that has kicked off a interest in diversity, inclusion, social justice books in the United States for both adults and kids. And here's what it looks like, just the 3-year trend for kids. So although we fell under last year, this summer, overall, our year-to-date sales are still up. And I do believe that this is going to be a trend that's going to continue in the US market anyway. So we're pretty bullish on books in the wider category that touch on diversity, inclusion, and social issues. And that does include books relative to Latino culture and bilingual education. Okay, so my key takeaways just in terms of the book market for you guys. Demand for books in the US is going to stay relatively strong for the rest of 2021. I think 2022, the US book market is going to be down because it is going to have a hard time staying at this level. But I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be probably a steep drop off in year to date in the first quarter because it was such a strong quarter last year. It was unbelievable. But overall, I think we're just returning to a more normal level. And I do expect 2022 to fall somewhere between 2021 and 2019. So I think we will stay elevated in 2022, but we're going to fall under 2021. I just pointing out that Christian book sales in the US at least have recovered to pre-pandemic levels, but they're not gaining on the overall market the way the US trade market is. But under there, I think that's a good result because not all churches and church bookstores are operating right now. And I do think we're in the middle of a transition in terms of retail. So there's some reinvention going on. There's some interesting publishing stories going on. And there's a bunch of things happening around the outside that I'm not quite seeing yet. So in general, I'm feeling pretty positive about the Christian market for 2022. I think in particular, Christian children's books are a really strong opportunity. I think in order to capitalize on it, though, you need to study what's going on that's really doing well in the general children's market and then figure out how to cross-pollinate that with a Christian viewpoint. So I do think that if I was going to invest in children's books, that's what I would be looking at. And I would also be looking very carefully at the age categories for competitiveness, because although the younger age groups are growing, there's also a ton of competition down there. So where are your opportunities in middle and teen books? Because I think there are some there. I also think the outlook for Spanish language books continues to be good. As I said, adult sales are up 39% since 2011, and kids are up 99% in the same period. And that interest in diversity and inclusion is making it a really unique moment for doing innovative publishing in this space. So trying to find a unique viewpoint that capitalizes on this interest, at least for the US market. And ECP asked me to talk about the future of engagement when I last spoke to them. So I wanted to share that with you guys here, meaning the future of engagement with Christian content. So I do think that empowered networks is part of the future. There's a really interesting program going on right now between the research organization Barna and the digital platform Glue, which is putting demographic information into the hands of ministry leaders in different communities to help them understand exactly who is around them and what that community looks like, so that those ministries can do a better job of engaging their local communities. And they've also created a platform where ministries can get together in a community and organize themselves to better serve that community. So I think that is really interesting. Instead of individual ministries and church leaders kind of struggling alone, trying to knit a fabric together to become more supportive and organized in local communities. Super interesting. Expanded formats. So I think audio for Christian is, in particular categories, has got lots of growth opportunity, and we're seeing a lot of interest in it. So podcasts, audiobooks. I think ebooks are, e-Bibles are still doing really well. Ebooks are going to drop down a little bit this year, but audio is here to stay. And what's happening between podcast personalities and audiobook sales, and kind of how those behaviors, streaming behaviors relate. Super interesting, and something that we're going to be studying more this year. I mentioned equity and inclusion and the opportunity around diversity and inclusion books across a wide range of topics, but not just in terms of race or culture. I also think looking at that point I made about women's publishing for empowerment for women, looking at how you can empower other communities through your publishing. All of that is sort of interest right now. And I think the demographics in the United States support having a very inclusive approach to your publishing. And then, of course, raising new readers, right? If we don't get children reading early, not just for Christian content, but content generally, then we are going to basically not have our future customers in place. But the good news is that the Pew Center, released their new statistics on reading in the US this year. It's I think it's every 5-year study. And they found out that younger generations are actually reading and engaging with books more than older generations, which is the reverse of what we would have seen 10 years ago. So Gen Z and millennials are reading and engaging with more book content than over 50, for instance. So that's a great leading indicator. So, we remain really bullish on children's books, and we want to encourage you guys to think about that if you are in the children's book publishing business. So that's it for me. There's my email on the screen. You guys are welcome to reach out anytime if you have questions or want to talk further about the data that you've seen here today. I hope that you guys have a really great conference, and I look forward to a future where we can all be in the same room together. That's it for me. Have a great day. Thanks very much.